Alpha Draven was a god among wolves. In 10 years of brutal warfare, he had never lost a drop of blood, never broken a bone, and never bowed to an enemy. The Obsidian Claws pack worshipped him as the Unbroken, believing the moon goddess herself had blessed his skin to be as hard as diamond. But Draven had a secret shame, a burden he hid within the walls of the Alpha house. His mate, Alara. While he was the picture of immortality, she was a ghost, always sick, always trembling, always covered in unexplained bruises that bloomed across her pale skin like dark flowers. He despised her weakness. He looked at her frail body and saw an insult to his legacy, a mistake of fate that needed correcting. So, fueled by the whispers of his pack and the seductive ambition of a warrior female named Viera, Draven did the unthinkable. He rejected his fated mate. He looked into Alara's tear-filled eyes, called her a dying bird, and banished her into the frozen winter night so he could finally be free of her burden. It was the single greatest mistake of his life, because less than 24 hours after Alara disappeared into the snow, Draven got into a meaningless skirmish with a rogue, and for the first time in history, he screamed. He looked down in horror to see his own blood soaking his chest, a wound that refused to heal. That was the moment the terrifying truth shattered his world. Alara hadn't been sick. She hadn't been weak. She was a sin-eater. For 10 years, she hadn't been dying of an illness. She had been silently absorbing every sword stroke, every punch, and every lethal blow meant for him, bleeding in the shadows so he could shine in the light. And now, she was gone. To understand how an alpha could be so blindly cruel, you have to understand the laws of the Obsidian Claws. In this pack, weakness is a capital offense. If you cannot hunt, you do not eat, and Draven was the brutal enforcer of this code. He walked through fire and ice convinced of his own divinity, never questioning why his battles left him energized while his mate at home was left bedridden for days. He didn't see the pattern. When he took a blow to the ribs in the training ring, he didn't feel it. But miles away, Alara would collapse in the kitchen, gasping for air as her ribs fractured invisibly. When he laughed off a poisoned arrow, he didn't see Alara sweating through a fever that nearly killed her that same night. He called her fragile, never realizing she was the only shield keeping him alive. Hours ago, a rogue berserker had swung a warhammer directly into Draven's ribs, a blow that would have pulverized the organs of a lesser wolf. Draven had barely flinched. He had felt a dull thud, a momentary breathlessness, and then he had decapitated his attacker with a single, fluid motion. Now, as the adrenaline faded, he waited for the bruising to set in, for the stiffness to claim his joints. But as always, there was nothing. His skin remained smooth, an expanse of golden bronze unbroken by the violence of his life. The Unbroken, a young pup squealed from the edge of the crowd gathering to welcome them. The chant picked up speed, rolling through the assembly like thunder. Unbroken, unbroken, unbroken. Draven didn't smile. Alphas of the Obsidian Claws did not smile, but a deep, vibrating purr of satisfaction rattled in his chest. He lived for this. He lived for the smell of pine mixed with the metallic tang of fresh kill, for the awe in the eyes of his subordinates. This was the natural order. Strength was the only currency that mattered in the frozen waste, and he was the wealthiest man alive. The great hall was already roaring with fire and noise by the time he entered. Carcasses of elk were roasting over the central spit, the fat hissing as it dropped into the flames. Draven took his seat at the high table, a throne carved from the black stone of the mountain. A goblet of mead was placed instantly in his hand. He drank deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of a hand that looked like it belonged to a statue, not a soldier. Another miracle campaign, Alpha. The voice was low, smoky, and laced with a challenge that teetered on the edge of insubordination. Draven didn't need to turn to know it was Viera. She slid onto the bench beside him, far closer than rank usually permitted. Viera was the pack's most lethal female enforcer, a woman carved from grit and tendon. Unlike Draven, she wore her history on her skin. A fresh gash ran from her temple to her jaw, stitched crudely with sinew weeping clear fluid. It looked painful. It looked glorious. "The southern rogues are scattered," Draven said, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the noise of the hall. "They broke against us like water against rock." "They broke against you," Viera corrected, reaching for his mead and taking a bold swig. She licked her lips, her eyes tracing the smooth muscle of his bicep. I took a blade to the shoulder for the pack today. Kaelin lost an ear. Even the pups have scars from training. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But you are pristine. It's unnatural, Draven. It's intoxicating. Draven flexed his hand, staring at the unblemished knuckles. The moon goddess protects those fit to rule. My body rejects injury because I am the apex. Or perhaps, Vieira purred, trailing a finger down his forearm, you are simply too strong for this world to damage. Her finger stopped, and her expression hardened, the seduction blending with political venom. It is a shame the same cannot be said for your other half. The air around the high table seemed to drop 10 degrees. The joyous noise of the feast faded into a dull roar in Draven's ears. He stiffened. Watch your tongue, Vieira. I only speak what the pack whispers, Alpha, she said, not backing down. She gestured to the empty seat beside him, the Luna's chair. It was cold, gathering dust. Look at it, empty again. On the night of your greatest victory, where is she? Is she presiding over the feast? Is she tending to the wounded? Or is she in her tower, coughing into a silk pillow because the wind changed direction? Draven slammed his goblet down, mead sloshing over the rim. Ilara is ill. Her constitution is delicate. Delicate? Vieira scoffed, spitting the word like a curse. She is a liability. We are the obsidian claws, Draven. We eat iron and bleed fire. And your mate, she is glass. She faints at the sight of blood. She bruises if you grip her too tight. Vieira leaned closer, her breath hot against his ear, smelling of spice and violence. An alpha needs a mate who can stand beside him in the shield wall, Draven. Someone who can run the hunt. Someone who understands the glory of the kill. Draven looked at Vieira. He saw the fire in her eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the fresh blood drying on her cheek. She was magnificent in a terrifying way. She was everything a wolf should be. Then his mind drifted to the tower room. He pictured Ilara. She would be pale, likely shivering under 3 fur blankets. He remembered the last time he had tried to be intimate with her, a week ago. He had barely touched her, a playful nip at her neck, and the next morning a horrific purple bruise had bloomed there as if he had tried to tear her throat out. He had felt like a monster. He hated feeling like a monster. He preferred feeling like a god. She cannot help her nature, Draven muttered, though the defense sounded weak even to his own ears. But you can choose yours, Vieira pressed, sensing the crack in his armor. The pack is growing restless, Alpha. They see you invincible, golden, perfect. And then they see her wasting away, sucking the resources of the healers, contributing nothing. They wonder, has the moon goddess made a mistake, or are you simply too stubborn to correct it? Draven looked out over the hall. His warriors were wrestling near the fire, showing off their wounds, boasting of their pain tolerance. They were proud of their scars. He had none to show, but he had the glory of the win. Ilara had neither scars nor glory. She had only silence and sickness. He felt a sudden, surging resentment. Why was he saddled with a corpse bride? Why did he, the greatest warrior of his generation, have to tiptoe around his own house for fear of shattering his mate? It wasn't fair. It was an anchor around his neck, dragging him down from the celestial heights he belonged in. Vieira saw the shift in his eyes. She smiled, a predator showing teeth. You are the god of war, Draven, she whispered, pulling back to leave him with his thoughts. Don't let a dying bird keep you from flying. Draven sat alone amidst the celebration, the empty chair beside him screaming louder than the cheers of his men. He looked at his hands, perfect, strong, unscarred. He deserved a mate who reflected that perfection. He deserved a queen, not a patient. As the fire crackled, and the drums began to beat. The decision didn't arrive as a sudden shock. It settled over him like a cold, inevitable frost. The pack was right. Vieira was right. Strength was the only truth, and if Ilara couldn't stand, she had no place by his side. The stone walls of the Alpha's keep were thick, built to withstand sieges and blizzards, yet they could not block out the sound of his glory. Ilara lay in the center of the massive 4-poster bed, the silk sheets heavy against her feverish skin, listening to the rhythmic thumping of feet on the floorboards below. The vibration traveled up through the stone, shaking the frame of her bed just enough to rattle her teeth. Every cheer of Unbroken felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the chasm that stretched between the great hall and this silent, freezing room. She tried to sit up, but a jagged spike of agony tore through her left side. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her ribs. She didn't need to look to know what she would find. If she were to lift her nightgown, the skin would be a mottled canvas of violent purple and black, blooming in the exact shape of a warhammer's impact. She hadn't left her room in 3 days, hadn't tripped, hadn't fallen. Yet her ribs screamed with the memory of a collision she had never experienced. Downstairs, her mate was drinking mead, laughing with a chest full of air, unmarked and perfect. Upstairs, Alara struggled to draw a single breath that didn't taste like copper. Luna. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of torchlight and the timid figure of Mara, a young Omega and the only wolf in the obsidian claws who looked at Alara with pity rather than contempt. Mara carried a tray with a bowl of broth, the steam rising in the chill air. "I'm here, Mara," Alara whispered. Her voice was a wreck, raspy and thin, as if she had spent hours screaming commands on a battlefield. Mara hurried to the bedside, setting the tray down with trembling hands. "The noise! I can ask them to quiet down, Luna. I can tell the Alpha you are resting." "No," Alara said quickly, wincing as she shifted her weight. "Do not disturb him. He is celebrating. He deserves his celebration." Mara bit her lip, her eyes scanning Alara's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises themselves. "They say he killed the rogue king with a single swing," the girl said softly, trying to offer news as a gift. "They say the rogue struck him with a hammer that would have shattered a boulder, and the Alpha didn't even stumble." Alara closed her eyes, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I'm sure he didn't," she breathed. "He is very strong." "He didn't stumble because I fell for him," she thought, the secret bitter on her tongue. "Help me to the window, Mara." "Luna, you shouldn't," the healer said. "Please." It was the command of a queen, however quietly spoken. Mara hesitated, then nodded. She wrapped a thick fur cloak around Alara's shoulders, hiding the frailty of her frame, and slid an arm around her waist. As Alara swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the room spun. Her knees felt like water. It wasn't just the ribs. Her shins throbbed with a dull, aching pressure, the kind of phantom pain that came from jumping from a great height and landing too hard. Draven must have leaped from the ramparts during the fight. He would have landed gracefully, a superhero touchdown. She, miles away, had felt her bones bow under the impact of his weight. With Mara taking most of her weight, Alara shuffled to the tall, narrow window that overlooked the courtyard. The glass was frosted with ice, but she rubbed a circle clear with her sleeve. Below, the world was on fire. Bonfires roared in the center of the snow-packed courtyard, sending sparks spiraling up into the black sky. Drunken warriors danced arm in arm, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the stone walls. And there, in the center of it all, was Draven. He was magnificent. He stood head and shoulders above the rest, his hair gleaming like spun gold in the firelight. He held a tankard high, his head thrown back in laughter. Viera was there too, pressing close to his side, her hand resting familiarly on his arm. She looked strong. She looked like she belonged there, amidst the blood and the fire. Alara pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She didn't hate Viera. How could she? Viera was everything the pack needed their Luna to be. Viera could hunt. Viera could fight. Viera didn't break. "He looks happy," Alara whispered, the condensation from her breath fogging the glass. "He should be up here with you," Mara muttered, a rare flash of anger in her voice. "It isn't right. You are his mate. You are sick, and he leaves you alone to drink with her." "He doesn't know, Mara." "He knows you are ill. He knows you are in pain." "He knows what he sees," Alara corrected gently. "He sees a broken vessel. He sees a genetic mistake." She leaned heavier on the windowsill, her eyes locked on Draven. He looked so invincible, so godlike. She remembered the day they met, before the bond fully snapped into place. He had been younger then, reckless, prone to injury. He had come home with a slashed arm, bleeding out. Alara had touched the wound, terrified, praying to the moon goddess to save him. And the goddess had answered. The wound had closed on his skin and opened on hers. It had taken her a year to understand the curse. Or perhaps the gift, the soul tether. It was an ancient, forbidden magic, usually reserved for blood slaves, but somehow the fates had woven it into their mating bond. She was his vessel. She was the attic portrait of Dorian Gray, rotting so he could remain pristine. A sudden flare of agony shot through her legs, causing them to buckle instantly. "Luna!" Mara shrieked, barely catching her before she hit the stone floor. Alara gasped, clutching Mara's tunic, her eyes squeezed shut. The pain in her shins was blinding, a sharp, cracking sensation. Down in the courtyard, Draven must have stomped his foot or kicked something heavy in a display of strength. Up here, Alara's tibia felt like it had been tapped with a sledgehammer. "I'm getting the healer," Mara cried, struggling to lift Alara back toward the bed. "This isn't just a fever, you're getting worse." "No healer," Alara wheezed, forcing her legs to work, forcing the scream back down her throat. "They can't fix this, just help me to the chair, by the fire." Mara wept as she dragged Alara to the velvet armchair, tucking the furs around her. "Why?" the girl sobbed. "Why are you so brittle, Luna? What is happening to you?" Alara waited until the wave of pain receded to a dull throb. She looked into the fire, watching the embers glow, imagining they were the same fires that warmed her mate outside. She could tell him. She could summon him right now, show him the bruises that matched his battles, show him the internal bleeding that mirrored his reckless fighting style. She could scream the truth. "I am not weak. I am the strongest one in this pack because I carry the weight of the alpha." But if she told him, the tether would break. That was the rule of the magic. If the beneficiary became aware of the sacrifice, the connection would sever. The wounds would return to their rightful owner. All the damage she had absorbed over the years, the concussions, the fractures, the poisons, would crash back onto him. Or worse, from this day forward, he would be mortal again. He would bleed. He might die. The pack needed a god. They didn't need a husband. Alara reached out and picked up the cold cup of broth. Her hand shook, the tremors rocking her entire body. She looked back toward the window, where the laughter was loudest. "Just a little longer," she whispered to the empty room, her voice so soft Mara couldn't hear it over the crackling logs. "He needs to win the northern campaign. He needs to secure the borders. Just a little longer, Draven. I can hold it. I can hold it all." She took a sip of the broth, swallowing the metallic taste of her own blood along with it. She would let them mock her. She would let Viera whisper poison in his ear. She would let Draven look at her with disgust. Because as long as he hated her, he was safe. And as long as she sat in the shadows, broken and ashamed, he would remain the Unbroken. The door to the Alpha's chambers didn't open. It exploded inward, kicked by a boot reinforced with steel and frustration. Draven stood in the threshold, framed by the flickering torchlight of the hallway, his chest heaving with the remnants of adrenaline and the potent heat of the victory mead. The noise from the great hall still swirled in his head, the chanting of his name, the rhythmic stomping of boots, the intoxicating praise of his warriors. He felt 10 feet tall. He felt like a titan carved from the mountain itself. He had wanted to bring that energy into this room, to perhaps finally shake his mate out of her eternal stupor. To force her to see the god he had become. But the room was dark. It smelled not of pine and winter air, but of copper and sickness. "Alara," he barked, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. There was no answer. The fire in the hearth had burned down to dying embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the furniture. Draven strode forward, his patience evaporating like steam. He rounded the foot of the bed and stopped dead. Alara was not in bed. She was collapsed on the bearskin rug, her body twisted in an awkward, unnatural angle. Her skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and sickly, but what drew his eye was the red. A pool of dark, viscous blood had gathered beneath her face, leaking from her nose and staining the white fur of the rug. She looked like a broken doll thrown away by a careless child. For a second, fear flickered in Draven's chest, a primal instinct to protect his mate. But just as quickly, it was smothered by a rising, suffocating wave of disgust. "Weak." The word echoed in his mind, sounding suspiciously like Viera's voice. "While you were severing heads and leading the pack to glory, She was here, bleeding on the floor because the air was too dry. Something inside Draven snapped. It was a tether that had been fraying for years, worn down by every pitying look his warriors gave him, every hushed whisper he pretended not to hear, every moment he had to leave a feast early to check on his invalid wife. The contrast between the god he was downstairs and the nursemaid he had to be upstairs was suddenly too much to bear. "Get up," he growled. Alara didn't move. Draven reached down, his grip harsh, and hauled her up by her arm. Her head lolled back, her eyes fluttering open, unfocused and glazed with pain. She looked at him through a haze of concussion, the ghost of the blow he had taken to the helmet hours ago, a blow he had laughed off while she had silently suffered the brain trauma. "Draven," she mumbled, her voice thick with blood. She tried to wipe her face, smearing the crimson across her pale cheek. "You're back." "I am back," he sneered, releasing her arm so abruptly she stumbled against the bedpost. "I returned a conqueror. The pack is chanting my name. They are burning offerings to my strength, and I come up here to find this." He gestured vaguely at her, at the blood, at the smell of illness that clung to the curtains. "Look at you, Alara, just look at you." Alara steadied herself against the wood, her breath hitching. She felt the room spinning. The pain in her head was a blinding white noise, but Draven's anger cut through it like a blade. I felt dizzy," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Draven, I didn't mean to ruin your night." "You don't ruin my night, Alara. You ruin my life." The words hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls. Alara flinched, not physically, but deep in her eyes, a light going out. Draven paced the room, his cape swirling around him, his energy manic. "Do you know what Viera said to me tonight? She asked if I was keeping a pet or a partner. She asked if the moon goddess was punishing me." He stopped and turned on her, his golden eyes blazing with cold fury. "I am the alpha of war. I am the Unbroken. I cannot be tethered to a dying bird that cannot even fly from the nest." "I have tried," Alara said softly, her hand trembling as she pulled her shawl tighter around her bruising shoulders. "I have tried to be what you need." "Your trying is killing my pack's respect for me," Draven roared, the sound shaking the glass in the window. "The pack needs a Luna who can hunt, who can fight, who can stand on a podium without looking like a stiff breeze will shatter her bones. You are nothing but a ghost haunting my house, Alara. You consume resources, you consume pity, and you give nothing back but silence and blood." Alara looked at him. She saw the exhaustion behind his rage. She saw the desperation of a man who wanted to be perfect and felt dragged down by the one flaw he couldn't fix. She wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tear open her robe and show him the bruise on her ribs that matched the dent in his armor. She wanted to say, "I am the reason you are unbroken." But she looked at the blood on the rug. If she told him, the bond would sever. The magic would break. And the next time a rogue swung a hammer at his chest, Draven would die. He had grown reckless, arrogant in his invincibility. He didn't know how to dodge anymore because he never had to. Without her, he was a dead man walking. She swallowed the truth. It tasted bitter, like bile and iron. "What do you want me to do, Draven?" she asked, her voice steady, terrifyingly calm. "I want you to leave," he said. The words came out fast, as if he had been practicing them. "I reject you, Alara. I reject the bond. I reject the weakness." He pointed to the heavy oak door. "Pack your things, or don't, just go. Find a place to die that isn't my responsibility. I am done carrying you." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire popped, a singular, loud crack. Alara didn't cry, she didn't beg. To Draven's shock, she didn't even argue. She simply straightened her spine, wincing slightly as her fractured ribs shifted. She looked around the room, the cold stone, the empty bed, the cage she had lived in for 10 years while absorbing his pain. "Okay," she whispered. She walked past him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She didn't reach for a bag. She didn't reach for a coat. She stopped only when she was inches from him. The heat radiating off his body was immense, the furnace of an alpha in his prime. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. Draven flinched, expecting her to claw him, to curse him, to scream. But her touch was feather-light. Her hand was cold, so cold against his burning skin. She looked up into his eyes, and for a moment the fog of her pain cleared, revealing a depth of sorrow so profound it nearly made him step back. "You are safe now, Draven," she said, her voice a fragile melody. "You are free." She paused, her thumb brushing the fabric of his tunic, right over the spot where the rogue's hammer had struck him, the spot where her own ribs were currently splintered. "But please," she whispered, a tear finally escaping to track through the dried blood on her cheek. "Be careful." She dropped her hand. Without another word, Alara turned and walked out the door. Draven stood frozen, the phantom sensation of her cold hand still burning on his chest. He heard her footsteps descend the stairs, slow and uneven. He heard the heavy front door of the keep groan open, letting in the howl of the blizzard, and then slam shut with a final, booming thud. He waited. He waited for the regret to hit him. He waited for the bond to scream in protest. But all he felt was the sudden rush of cool air from the hallway. His shoulders, which had been tensed for a decade, finally dropped. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful. No more coughing, no more smell of medicine, no more pitying looks from the pack. He walked to the window and looked down. Through the swirling snow, he saw a small, solitary figure trudging toward the tree line, disappearing into the white void of the forest. The storm was brutal tonight. She wouldn't last until morning. Draven turned his back on the window. He walked to the side table, poured himself another glass of mead, and drained it in one swallow. The burn was pleasant. Finally, he breathed into the empty room. He slept deeply that night, dreamless and heavy, the sleep of a man who believed he had just cut away the rotting limb that was killing him. He didn't know that he had actually cut out his own heart, and that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming for him. For 2 days, the silence in the Alpha's keep was not hollow. It was holy. It was the silence of a temple finally cleared of its clutter, a space where Draven could finally hear his own thoughts without the background static of illness and pity. The air smelled of wood smoke and polished leather, no longer tainted by the medicinal herbs Mara used to brew for Alara's constant fevers. Draven moved through his life with a newfound lightness. It was as if he had been walking uphill with a sack of stones on his back for a decade, and someone had finally cut the straps. The pack sensed it, too. The tension that usually knotted the shoulders of the obsidian claws had loosened. Their alpha was focused. He was unburdened. When he walked into the training grounds, the warriors didn't look at him with that guarded sympathy anymore. They looked at him with unadulterated awe. "You move faster today, Alpha," Viera noted, circling him in the sparring ring, a playful grin on her scarred lips. She feinted left, then swung a wooden staff at his head. Draven didn't even blink. He caught the staff in one hand, twisting it from her grip with a casual flick of his wrist. "I feel faster," he admitted, tossing the weapon back to her. "I feel clear." "It's because the rot is gone," Viera said bluntly, catching the staff. "A wolf cannot run with a thorn in its paw. You finally pulled it out." Draven didn't correct her. He didn't feel the pang of guilt he expected to feel at the mention of Alara. He had convinced himself that what he did was mercy. Alara wasn't built for this world. By sending her away, he had simply let nature take its course, freeing them both from a bond that was slowly strangling his legacy. He was the Unbroken, and now, finally, his home reflected his invincibility. The peace lasted exactly 48 hours. It was broken just past dawn on the 3rd day by a scout sprinting into the courtyard, breathless and dusting snow from his pelt. "Rogue movement," the scout reported, panting as Draven descended the stone steps to meet him. "Eastern Ridge, small pack, maybe 4 or 5. They're scavenging near the old lumber mill." Draven sighed, a sound of boredom rather than concern. Rogues were pests, rats that scurried around the edges of his kingdom hopping for scraps. Usually, he would send a beta to handle such a trivial annoyance. But today, the sun was bright, the air was crisp, and he felt invincible. He wanted to stretch his legs. He wanted to feel the crunch of snow under his boots and remind the world why the obsidian claws were the apex predators of the north. "Saddle the horses," Draven commanded, though his wolf was itching to run. "I'll handle them myself. Viera, you're with me." Viera beamed, her eyes lighting up with the thrill of the hunt. "It will be a slaughter," she promised. It should have been. It was a skirmish so minor it wouldn't have even made the footnotes of Draven's war journals. When they arrived at the lumber mill, the rogues were already cowering. They were a pathetic sight, manged fur, ribs showing through thin coats, eyes wide with the terror of prey that realizes it has walked into a lion's den. There were 4 of them, scavengers, nobody of consequence. Draven dismounted, his black cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a crow. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't need steel for trash like this. He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the freezing air. "Leave," Draven rumbled, his voice projecting across the clearing. "Leave now, and you keep your heads." The largest of the rogues, a gray wolf with a missing eye and desperation etched into every line of his face, snarled. It was a sound of fear, not aggression. "We are starving," the rogue shouted. "We only took the scraps." "And now you are stealing my patience," Draven countered, stepping forward. He radiated power. The golden aura of his alpha status pulsed around him, a physical weight that usually forced lesser wolves to their knees. But hunger makes fools brave. With a ragged howl, the gray rogue lunged. It was a sloppy attack, telegraphed from a mile away. The rogue leaped, claws extended, aiming for Draven's chest. In any other timeline, in any other battle of the last 10 years, Draven would have laughed. He would have stood still, let the rogue strike him, and watched as the claws skid harmlessly off his skin like knives against granite. He had done it 100 times. It was his signature move, the ultimate display of dominance. To not even deign to dodge, to let the enemy break themselves against his perfection. So Draven didn't move. He stood his ground, chin high, chest exposed, waiting for the impact that would feel like nothing more than a dull tap. He expected invincibility. He received reality. The rogue's claws didn't slide off. They caught. The sound was wet and tearing, the sickening noise of fabric ripping, but the fabric was skin. For a split second, Draven's brain refused to process the sensory input. It was a data error. "This is wrong," his mind insisted. "I am the Unbroken." Then the pain hit. It wasn't a dull thud. It was a searing, blinding white light that exploded in the center of his chest. It felt like someone had poured molten lead into his veins. It was sharp, hot, and agonizingly immediate. The nerve endings, dormant and pampered for a decade, screamed in a chorus of absolute shock. ARGH. The sound that tore from Draven's throat was not a battle cry. It was a scream, a raw, guttural shriek of genuine, confused agony. He stumbled back, his boots slipping in the snow. The world tilted on its axis. He looked down. Red. Bright, vivid crimson was bubbling up through the tears in his tunic. It flowed fast, hot and sticky, soaking the black fabric and dripping onto the pristine white snow. Draven stared at it. He blinked, expecting the hallucination to fade. He touched his chest and his fingers came away wet. His blood. This was his blood. The clearing went dead silent. The rogue who had struck him had landed on all fours, trembling, looking at his own claws. They were coated in alpha blood. The rogue looked more terrified than Draven. The rogue stammered, backing away, his single eye wide with disbelief. I hurt him. "Alpha," Vieira's voice cracked. She was standing 10 feet away, her sword half-drawn, frozen in a tableau of shock. She looked at Draven's chest, then at his face, her expression crumbling from arrogance to confusion. Draven. Draven couldn't answer. The pain was overwhelming. It throbbed with every beat of his heart, a rhythmic torture he had never experienced. He pressed his hand over the wounds, 3 deep, parallel gashes running from his collarbone to his sternum, and gasped for air. It burned. Gods, why did it burn so much? He had seen men lose limbs. He had seen warriors gutted. He had always looked at them with a detached sympathy, never understanding why they screamed, why they cried, why they couldn't just stand up. Now his knees shook. The wind bit into the open wounds, stinging like acid. "Kill them!" Vieira suddenly shrieked, snapping out of her trance. She launched herself at the rogue, her movements fueled by panic. The rest of the patrol surged forward, tearing the rogues apart in seconds, silencing the witnesses to this impossibility. But Draven didn't join the fight. He fell to one knee, clutching his chest. This isn't possible, he thought, his mind racing frantically through every explanation, every curse, every variable. I am blessed by the moon. I am the god of war. Why am I bleeding? Why does it hurt? He looked at the dead rogue lying in the snow. A starving scavenger with dull claws. That thing had hurt him. That thing had drawn the blood of the Unbroken. A cold dread, far sharper than the winter wind, began to coil in his gut. It wasn't the wound that terrified him. The wound was superficial, survivable. It was the implication. The shield was gone. The barrier that had separated him from the mortal suffering of his kin had vanished into thin air. What changed? His mind flashed back to the last time he had bled. 10 years ago, a training accident. He had been a boy, and then he had met Alara. No, he pushed the thought away. That was impossible. Alara was a weakling. Alara was a fragile, broken thing that bled if the wind blew too hard. She had nothing to do with his strength. She was the antithesis of his strength. But as he stared at the red snow, clutching a chest that throbbed with a pain he hadn't felt in a decade, the silence of the forest seemed to mock him. The lightness he had felt for the last 2 days suddenly felt heavy, pressing down on him like the lid of a coffin. Alpha, let me see. Viera was at his side, her hands hovering over the wound, her eyes wide with fear. We need a healer. We need to get you back. Don't touch me, Draven hissed through gritted teeth, struggling to stand. He needed to hide this. He needed to understand this. He stood, swaying slightly, the pain radiating out to his fingertips. He was mortal. For the first time since he took the Alpha Oath, he was just a man made of meat and bone. And suddenly, the world was a very, very dangerous place. The ride back to the stronghold was a blur of white snow and red agony. Every hoofbeat of his horse sent a fresh jolt of fire through Draven's chest, a sensation so foreign and consuming that he nearly fell from the saddle twice. He refused help. He refused Viera's panicked offers to stitch him up in the field. He needed answers that needle and thread could not provide. He needed to understand why the laws of his existence had suddenly shattered. By the time he kicked open the door to the elder's hut, situated on the desolate, wind-swept edge of the camp, Draven was pale and sweating, his tunic stiff with drying blood. The hut smelled of dried sage, rotting wood, and the musk of ancient things. Elder Nyra sat by a low fire, her eyes milky with cataracts, her hands gnarled like tree roots as she ground herbs in a stone mortar. She didn't look up as the alpha of the obsidian claws stumbled in, clutching his chest like a wounded deer. You bleed, Draven, she said, her voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over stone. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded resigned. Fix it, Draven growled, collapsing onto the furs opposite her. He pulled his tunic open, revealing the 3 angry gashes the rogue had left. And then tell me why it happened. Why did a scavenger's claw pierce my skin? Why didn't it break against me? Nyra stopped grinding. She turned her clouded gaze toward him, sniffing the air. The scent of iron is strong on you. It has been a long time since I smelled your blood, Alpha. 10 years, I believe. I am the Unbroken, Draven snapped, though the title felt fragile in his mouth now. I do not bleed. It is a gift from the moon. A gift, Nyra repeated, a bitter smile twisting her thin lips. She reached out, her cold fingers tracing the edges of the wound. Draven hissed in pain, pulling back. Pain is a teacher, boy. You have been skipping its lessons for a decade. She wiped his blood from her fingers onto a rag and looked at him with an expression that shifted from clinical detachment to a deep, horrifying pity. It was a look that chilled him more than the winter wind outside. It was the look one gave to a child who had unknowingly burned down their own house. Where is she? Nyra asked suddenly. Draven blinked, the non sequitur throwing him off. Who? The girl, the shadow, your mate. Draven's jaw tightened. Alara is gone. I sent her away 3 days ago. I severed the dead weight so the pack could thrive. The silence that followed was absolute. Nyra stared at him, her milky eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. Her hands began to tremble, not with age but with horror. She covered her mouth, a gasp escaping her throat. "You fool," she breathed. The words were a whisper, but they hit Draven harder than the rogue's claws. "You absolute, arrogant fool." "Do not speak to me that way, witch," Draven warned, though his voice lacked its usual command. "I did what was necessary. She was sick. She was weak." "She was not sick," Nyra screamed, slamming her hand down on the small table, sending jars rattling. "She was never sick. She was the strongest wolf this pack has ever produced, and you threw her into the snow to die for it." Draven recoiled, stunned by the outburst. "What are you talking about? She couldn't walk without fainting. She bled from the nose if the wind changed." "Because of you," Nyra pointed a shaking finger at his chest, right at the fresh, oozing wound. "Do you truly believe you are a god, Draven? Do you think flesh and bone can withstand steel without magic? There is no such thing as an invincible wolf. There is only the soul tether." Draven stared at her, the blood draining from his face. "The what?" "The soul tether, the Sin-Eater's bond." Nyra's voice dropped to a frantic hiss, as if she were revealing a secret that could crack the earth. "It is an ancient, cruel magic, lost to time. Sometimes, very rarely, when a mating bond is formed between two souls of immense disparity, the goddess grants a balance. One mate becomes the shield, the other the sword. One takes the glory, and the other takes the damage." Draven felt the room spinning. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "It transfers instantly," Nyra continued, her eyes filling with tears. "Invisibly. When you are struck, the bond shunts the kinetic energy, the tearing of tissue, the breaking of bone, directly to the mate. You don't feel it because she feels it for you." "No," Draven whispered, shaking his head. That's impossible." "Is it?" Nyra challenged. "Think, Draven, use that mind you've been too arrogant to open." She leaned in close, her face inches from his. "2 days ago, you mocked her for a nosebleed. You found her on the floor, bleeding onto the rug. What happened to you that morning?" Draven's mind flashed back. The training ring. He had been sparring with Viera. She had slipped past his guard and landed a solid, ringing cross to his face. He remembered laughing it off. He remembered the crowd cheering because his nose hadn't even crunched. I took a punch," he stammered. "In the ring." "And she bled," Nyra confirmed. "And last month, the council meeting, you told me Alara had fractured 3 ribs coughing. You called her brittle. What happened to you the day before?" The memory hit him like a physical blow. The mountain hunt. He had been chasing an elk. He had slipped on an icy ledge and fallen 20 feet, slamming his side against a granite outcrop. He had stood up, dusted himself off, and continued the hunt, marveling at his own durability. "I fell," Draven whispered, his voice trembling. "I hit the rocks." "You fell," Nyra said mercilessly. "And she broke. Every cut you ignored. Every bruise you didn't feel. Every time you walked away from a battle thinking you were the chosen one, she was at home, screaming into a pillow so you wouldn't hear her agony." Draven looked down at his chest. The pain was throbbing, real and undeniable. "You sent her away," Nyra said, her voice breaking. "You severed the proximity. The tether stretches, but once the distance becomes too great, or if the rejection is absolute, the connection breaks. That is why you bleed today, Alpha, not because the rogue was strong, but because your shield is gone." Draven sat frozen. The horror was a cold liquid filling his lungs. He thought of Alara's pale face. He thought of the constant bruises he had accused her of being clumsy for. He thought of the way she would look at him after he returned from war, not with fear, but with a desperate, exhaustive relief. "You are safe now, Draven." Her final words echoed in his skull. "But please, be careful." She knew, she had always known. She had lived her life as a human voodoo doll, absorbing the violence of his world so he could play God. She hadn't been sick. She had been being beaten to death by his victories. "I called her weak," Draven whispered, the realization bringing him to his knees. He clutched his hair, his fingers digging into his scalp. "I told the whole pack she was a burden. I told her to find a place to die." "And she likely has," Nyra said, turning back to her herbs, though her hands were still shaking. "A Sin-Eater's body is ravaged by the years of transferred trauma. Without the bond to anchor her, the cumulative damage. She will not last long in the storm. Draven didn't hear the rest. A roar was building in his chest, a sound of pure, undiluted self-hatred. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. The wound didn't matter. The blood didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the image of Alara walking into the blizzard, her hand over her heart, his heart. "Where are you going?" Nyra called out as he stumbled toward the door. "To find her," Draven choked out. "To beg, to bleed." He burst out of the hut into the freezing afternoon. The pain in his chest flared with every step, a constant, biting reminder of the truth. He welcomed it. He hoped it would hurt more. He hoped it would tear him apart, because whatever pain he felt now was only a fraction of what Alara had carried for him in silence for 10 long, brutal years. Draven sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the room pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The chamber was exactly as she had left it, the fire dead, the curtains drawn, the faint, lingering scent of lavender and antiseptic hanging in the stagnant air. The only difference was the dark stain on the bearskin rug where her blood had pooled 3 days ago, and the fresh bandage wrapped around his own chest, tight and constricting against the throbbing gashes the rogue had left. He stared at the bloodstain. It was a Rorschach test of his own damnation. Elder Nyra's words were a poison that had finally reached his heart. The soul tether. The concept swirled in his mind, fighting against a decade of arrogance, but the walls of his denial had already crumbled. The pain in his chest was the proof. The blood on his tunic was the seal. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't look forward to the next conquest. He looked back. He forced himself to walk into the graveyard of his memories, carrying the lantern of this new, horrific truth. He replayed the highlight reel of his life, the moments that had cemented his legend as the Unbroken, and superimposed them over the shadow life of the woman he had called a burden. The challenge of the Grey Valley. He had been 22. A massive rival alpha seeking to expand his territory had challenged Draven to single combat. Draven remembered the fight vividly. He remembered the rival getting a lock around his throat, a forearm thick as a tree trunk squeezing his windpipe. He remembered the panic, the crushing pressure, the black spots dancing in his vision. He was seconds away from passing out, and then, suddenly, the pressure had vanished. The rival hadn't let go, but the sensation of choking simply stopped. Draven had surged back, gasping in a breath of sweet air, and snapped the rival's neck. He had walked away, thinking his trachea was made of iron. But now the memory shifted. He remembered coming home that night, high on the thrill of survival. He remembered finding Alara sitting up in bed, clutching her throat, her face flushed and terrifyingly swollen. She could barely speak. Her voice was a ragged whisper for a week. "It's just a throat infection," she had wheezed, hiding her neck with a scarf. "You are always sick," he had scoffed, annoyed that her coughing was keeping him awake. "Try to breathe quietly, Alara. I have a pack to lead in the morning." Draven let out a low, strangled sound in the empty room, burying his face in his hands. She hadn't had an infection. She had been strangling in his place. While he breathed easy, celebrating his victory, she had spent a week gasping for air as if an invisible noose were tightened around her neck. The memory dissolved, replaced by another, sharper and more cruel. The ambush at Black River. 3 years ago, an assassination attempt. An arrow tipped with concentrated wolfsbane had struck him in the thigh. Wolfsbane was a death sentence for wolves. It burned the blood, seized the muscles, and stopped the heart. Draven had pulled the arrow out, expecting the end. He had felt the burning start, and then it just faded. It became a dull itch. He had marched home, laughing, telling his warriors that his blood was too potent for poison to take hold. He was a god. Poison was for mortals. That same night, Alara had collapsed. Her fever had spiked to a temperature that should have boiled her brain. She had hallucinated for 3 days, screaming about fire in her veins. Her body had convulsed so violently they had to tie her to the bed. Draven remembered standing in the doorway, looking at her thrashing form with disdain. "She has no constitution," he had told Viera, who stood beside him shaking her head. "A little flu knocks her down. It's embarrassing." "I'm sorry," Alara had wept during a moment of clarity, her eyes wide and terrified as the poison ravaged her system. I'm so sorry I'm weak, Draven. She was apologizing. She was apologizing for dying from the poison meant for him. She was apologizing for the agony of processing a toxin that should have stopped his heart in minutes, filtering it through her own fragile organs so he could keep standing. Draven gripped his own hair, pulling until it hurt, needing a physical anchor to keep from screaming. He was a parasite. He wasn't a god. He was a tick, bloated and full, feeding on the life force of the only creature who had ever loved him unconditionally. But the worst memory was the one that had nothing to do with enemies. 6 months ago, a diplomatic meeting had gone wrong. Draven had lost his temper, a rare volcanic eruption of rage. He had punched the stone wall of the council chamber. He had put everything he had into that strike, enough force to shatter concrete. The wall had cracked. His hand, miraculously, had been fine. Not a bruised knuckle, not a broken bone. He had looked at his fist in wonder, flexing the fingers, feeling powerful. The next morning, he had seen Alara wrapping her right hand in bandages. She was clumsy, putting the splint on with her left hand, wincing with every movement. "What did you do now?" he had asked, rolling his eyes. "I shut it in the cellar door," she had lied, refusing to meet his eyes. "I'm clumsy, you know that." He hadn't shut it in a door. He had shattered her hand. His rage, his temper, his violence, she absorbed that too. He had punched a wall, and miles away, the bones in her hand had snapped like dry twigs, and she hadn't said a word. She had let him believe she was clumsy rather than let him know he had hurt her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. She knew. She had always known. Alara wasn't stupid. She understood the bond better than he did. She knew that every time he walked into battle, she was walking into a torture chamber. She knew that every time he recklessly threw his body into harm's way, relying on his gift, he was using her body as a shield. And she never told him. Why? Draven looked at the empty pillow where her head used to rest. Why keep the secret? Why endure the mockery, the shame, the isolation? Why let the whole pack, and her own mate, believe she was a defective, useless waste of space? Because if she told him, the legend would die. If the pack knew that their alpha wasn't invincible, that he was just a man protected by a woman's sacrifice, his authority would crumble. The fear that kept their enemies at bay would vanish. The Unbroken was a symbol that held the obsidian claws together, and Alara had decided that the symbol was more important than her life. She had chosen to be the villain of his story, so he could be the hero. She had chosen to be the dying bird, so he could be the eagle. "You protected me," Draven whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "You protected me from the truth. You protected me from myself." He stood up, his legs shaking. He walked to the wardrobe, which was still half full of her clothes. He touched a gray wool dress, the one she wore most often because it was thick enough to hide the bruises. He buried his face in the fabric. It didn't smell like her anymore. It smelled like dust. He had rejected her. He had called her a ghost. He had told her to find somewhere else to die. And she had touched his heart, the heart that was beating only because she had taken the arrows meant to stop it, and told him to be careful. She knew that by leaving, she was severing the tether. She knew that once she walked out that door, the shield would drop. She wasn't telling him to be careful as a platitude. She was warning him. She was telling him, "I can't save you anymore." "I am not the alpha," Draven choked out, tears finally spilling over, hot and stinging. "I am nothing. I am just a man who beat his wife to death with his own ego." He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase on the nightstand, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the stone wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot, but his hand hurt. His knuckles throbbed. The skin split. He looked at the blood welling on his hand. Pain, real, sharp, immediate pain. Alara wasn't there to feel it for him. He sank to the floor amidst the shards of pottery, surrounded by the ghosts of his own arrogance. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was a judgment. It was a tomb. And he realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that he didn't just need to find her to save her. He needed to find her to beg for a forgiveness he knew he would never, ever deserve. It began the next morning. not with a roar but with a snap. Draven woke with a gasp, his body drenched in cold sweat. He tried to swing his legs out of bed, a motion he had performed 10,000 times with the fluid grace of a predator, but as his left foot touched the stone floor, his knee collapsed. A sickening crunch echoed through the silent room, followed by a blinding white spike of agony that shot up his thigh and lodged itself in his spine. He fell hard, his shoulder slamming into the nightstand, sending the pitcher of water crashing down to join the shattered vase from the night before. Draven lay in the puddle of water, clutching his knee, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He looked down. His knee was swollen, turning a violently dark shade of purple before his eyes. It felt as though a war hammer had just smashed into the joint. The Siege of Highlands, his mind whispered. 3 years ago, he had jumped from a siege tower, landing awkwardly on uneven ground. He remembered the moment vividly, the jarring impact, the way his leg had buckled. But back then, he had simply rolled through the fall, stood up, and kept fighting. He hadn't felt a thing. Now, 3 years late, the debt had come due. Draven gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. He grabbed the heavy oak bedpost and hauled himself upright. His legs screamed in protest, refusing to bear weight. He was an alpha. He was the Unbroken. He would not crawl in his own home. But as he straightened his spine, a fresh wave of misery washed over him. His ribs ached with a dull, grinding pressure, as if an invisible vice were slowly tightening around his chest. The rogue's claw marks were still angry and red, but they were now joined by a constellation of yellowing bruises that were blossoming across his torso like mold on rotting fruit. He limped to the mirror. The man staring back at him was a stranger. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark circles that looked like charcoal smudges. His skin, usually a vibrant bronze, was gray and papery. But it was the scars that stopped his heart. Thin, silvery lines were tracing themselves across his arms and chest, appearing out of nowhere, stitching themselves into his flesh in real time. A slash across his bicep from a knife fight 5 years ago. A puncture wound on his shoulder from a stray arrow during the Winter War. The soul tether hadn't just been a shield, it had been a dam. For a decade, Alara had held back the river of his mortality. Now that he had severed the bond, the dam had burst. 10 years of violence, 10 years of trauma, 10 years of reckless, godlike warfare were flooding back into the body that had earned them. He wasn't just injured, he was expiring. Draven dressed with the clumsy slowness of an old man, hiding the bruises under a high-collared tunic and a heavy fur cloak. He had to face the pack. He had to show them he was still their alpha. If they smelled weakness, the hierarchy would collapse. But the moment he stepped into the courtyard, he knew the masquerade was over. The morning training session stopped. The clang of steel on steel died away. 50 warriors turned to look at their leader, and the silence that followed was heavy with confusion and horror. Draven tried to walk tall. He set his jaw, squared his shoulders, and took a step, but his left leg wouldn't cooperate. He dragged it, a heavy, dead thing, resulting in a pronounced, agonizing limp. Every step was a battle. He was sweating profusely in the freezing air, beads of perspiration freezing on his forehead. Alpha. It was Kalen, his beta. The massive wolf stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Are you injured? Back to training, Draven barked, but his voice, usually a thunderclap, cracked. It came out wheezy and thin. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and tasted copper. He kept walking, aiming for the command tent, but the ground seemed to pitch and roll beneath him. His vision swam. A sharp, stabbing pain erupted in his lower back, a disc slipping, a remnant of a wrestling match from his youth. He stumbled, catching himself on a weapon rack. The rack rattled, spears clattering to the ground. The Unbroken had stumbled. A murmur rippled through the pack. Wolves exchanged glances. This was the man who had walked through fire. This was the deity who laughed at blades. He looked like he was decomposing from the inside out. Draven. Viera emerged from the sparring ring. She wasn't smiling today. Her usually sharp, predatory face was slack with shock. She walked toward him, not with the seductive swagger she had used days ago, but with a hesitant, fearful gait. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes raking over his trembling hands, his dragging leg, the sweat soaking his collar. "What is happening to you?" she whispered, loud enough for the nearby warriors to hear. You look like you've been fighting a war for 100 years." "I am fine," Draven lied, the words slurring slightly as a phantom migraine. Likely a concussion from a past shield bash split his skull. "Just old wounds, stiffness." "Stiffness?" Vieira reached out, grabbing his arm to steady him. Draven hissed. Her grip landed directly on a fresh, invisible bruise that felt like a fracture. He pulled away violently, losing his balance and falling to one knee in the snow. The gas from the pack was collective. The god of war was on his knees, not in prayer but in weakness. Vieira stared at her hand, then at him. She looked at the blood seeping through his tunic, not just from the rogue's wound, but from old incisions reopening, scar tissue failing to hold. The reality of the situation crashed into her with the force of a landslide. She looked toward the Alpha's keep, toward the tower window where Alara used to sit. Then she looked back at Draven, the pieces finally clicking together in her mind. It was her, Vieira breathed. Draven looked up, his golden eyes dim and filled with pain. "Vieira." "It was never you," she said, her voice rising, bordering on hysterical. "All those battles, the siege, the Black River, you didn't survive them because you were strong. You survived them because she was dying for you." "Quiet," Draven rasped, trying to stand, but his legs refused. "I didn't know," Vieira said, stepping back, her hands shaking. "Draven, I didn't know." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of guilt and tears of a shattered idol. "I told you she was weak. I told you to get rid of her. I thought she was dragging you down." She looked at him with a mixture of horror and revulsion. "I didn't know she was the reason you were standing up." The pack heard it. The truth spread like wildfire through the ranks. The whispers started, harsh and judging. He wasn't chosen. He was a leech. The Luna took his hits. He killed her. Draven felt the weight of their judgment, heavier than any armor. But it paled in comparison to the physical collapse happening within his own skin. He could feel his organs struggling. His lungs felt scarred, stiffening with the memory of smoke inhalation from a burning village 5 years ago. His heart stuttered, skipping beats, remembering the time it had nearly stopped from exhaustion during the Great Hunt. He was aging a decade in a day. The cumulative toll of a life lived without consequence was crashing down on him all at once. The interest on the debt was lethal. "Help him up," Kaelin ordered quietly. 2 warriors rushed forward, hoisting Draven to his feet. He hated it. He hated the pity in their grip. He was their king, and they were handling him like a piece of fragile porcelain, like Alara. Gods, is this how she felt every day? The thought nearly brought him to his knees again. The constant ache, the inability to trust your own body, the shame of needing help to simply cross a room. He had mocked her for this. He had sneered at her frailty, and now he was drowning in it. "Take me to the stables," Draven wheezed, leaning heavily on Kaelin. "Alpha, you need the healer," Kaelin argued gently. "You cannot ride." "I said take me to the stables," Draven roared, though the effort forced a spasm of coughing that sprayed droplets of blood onto the white snow. He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. "I am going to find her." "Draven," Vieira stepped in his path again. "Look at you. You won't make it to the tree line. You're dying." "Then I will die on the road," Draven spat, his eyes burning with a desperate, feverish light. "I will not die in this castle of lies." He pushed past her, dragging his ruined leg, each step a testament to a stubbornness that defied biology. He understood now. The deterioration wasn't going to stop. The soul tether was gone, and his body was rapidly reconciling the ledger. He didn't have years. He might not even have days. He had to find Alara, not just to apologize, not just to beg, but because without her he was nothing but a collection of scars held together by pride. And as the cold wind hit his fever-hot face, he realized the cruelest joke of all. Even broken, battered, and banished, Alara was still the only thing keeping him alive. If she had died out there in the storm, then he was already a walking corpse. He was chasing a ghost, and he was becoming one himself. The black stallion, a beast bred for war, stamped its hooves in the churned mud of the stable yard, sensing the unnatural weakness radiating from its master. Draven stood by the stirrup, his hand gripping the leather saddle, his knuckles white. He tried to pull himself up, a motion that should have been effortless, a fluid ascent he had performed thousands of times in full armor. But his body was a traitor. As he put weight on his left leg, the knee, the one he had unknowingly shattered years ago in the Highlands, gave way with a sickening pop. Draven collapsed into the slush, the horse whinnying in alarm and skittering sideways. "Alpha!" Kalen was there instantly, his hands hovering, terrified to touch the man who was visibly disintegrating. Draven snarled, swatting the hands away. He lay in the mud for a second, breathing hard. The air in his lungs felt like swallowed glass. His ribs, fracturing under the ghostly weight of old blows, grated against each other with every inhalation. He looked up at the towering horse. He couldn't ride. The vibration alone would tear his internal organs apart. "I walk," Draven wheezed, forcing himself to his knees. "You cannot walk, Draven," Viera said, her voice trembling. She stood by the gate, wrapped in furs, looking at him with the expression one wears at a funeral. "The storm is a blizzard now. Visibility is 0. You are bleeding through your bandages already if you go out there. You aren't coming back." Draven used the stable wall to haul himself upright. He wiped the mud from his face, leaving a streak of grime that looked like war paint. "Good," he rasped. "Then I die seeking the truth, rather than rotting in a castle built on lies." He turned his back on them. He turned his back on the warmth of the keep, the smell of roasting meat, and the safety of the pack he had led for a decade. He limped toward the open gates, his left leg dragging through the snow, leaving a furrow that looked like a grave being dug in real time. No one tried to stop him. To stop an alpha, even a broken one, was treason. They simply watched, silent witnesses to the fall of a god, as the white curtain of the storm swallowed him whole. The forest was a howling void. The wind screamed through the pines, whipping snow into a frenzy that stung exposed skin like sand. Draven didn't feel the cold. His body was burning with a fever that raged at 103 degrees, the ghost of the wolfsbane poisoning, finally claiming its due. He tracked her the only way he could, by scent. It was faint, nearly buried under the smell of pine and ice, but it was there. Lavender, soap, and the metallic, terrifying scent of old blood. It was a breadcrumb trail of suffering leading into the dark. Every step was a penance. Crunch, drag, gasp. The rhythm became his mantra. With every agonizing jolt of his knee, with every searing flare of pain in his chest, Draven felt a twisted sense of connection. This was what she had felt. When he had marched the pack 20 miles in a day, setting a brutal pace, Alara had been at home, likely crawling from her bed to the bathroom, her legs throbbing with the phantom lactic acid of his exertion. When he had stood tall in the council meetings, ignoring the fatigue of a 3-day hunt, she had been collapsing in the nursery, overwhelmed by an exhaustion she hadn't earned. He had called her lazy. He had called her soft. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wind, the words snatched away instantly. "I'm so sorry." As the pain mounted, blurring the line between reality and memory, the forest began to dissolve. He wasn't in the snow anymore. He was back in the training ring 5 years ago. He saw himself, shirtless and glistening, sparring with 3 warriors at once. He was laughing, dodging, taking hits that would have felled an ox. And there, on the balcony overlooking the ring, was Alara. He remembered being annoyed by her presence. She wasn't cheering. She was gripping the railing so hard her knuckles were white. Every time a wooden sword slammed into Draven's ribs, Alara would flinch. Her face would go pale. Her hand would fly to her own side. He had thought she was squeamish. He had thought she was embarrassed by the violence. "If you cannot stomach the sight of blood, go inside," he had yelled at her that day, playing to the crowd. The warriors had laughed. Alara had looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, clutching her side. She hadn't said a word. She had just turned and limped away. Draven stumbled over a buried root, crashing face first into a snowbank. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He coughed, spitting red into the white. She hadn't been squeamish. She had been taking the blows. She had been standing on that balcony, literally absorbing the impact of 3 men attacking her husband, and he had humiliated her for it. She had watched him preen and boast, knowing that the only reason he was standing was because she was breaking. He clawed his fingers into the frozen earth, dragging himself forward. He couldn't stand up again. His legs were done, so he crawled. He crawled like a beggar. He crawled like the dying bird he had accused her of being. The guilt was heavier than the snow. It pressed on his neck, suffocating him. How could he have been so blind? How could his ego have been so massive that it eclipsed the woman bleeding right in front of him? He remembered the nights after his great victories. He would come to bed, high on adrenaline, wanting to celebrate. But Alara was always asleep, turned away from him, buried under blankets. He had thought she was cold. He had thought she was withholding affection. Now he knew. She hadn't been asleep. She had been lying there in agony, biting her lip to keep from screaming, her body covered in the fresh bruises of his triumph. She hid her pain so he wouldn't feel guilty. She denied herself comfort so he could keep his illusion of perfection. "Alara," he screamed, his voice raw and broken. He needed to tell her he knew, even if she was dead, even if he found her frozen corpse under a tree. He needed to whisper into her cold ear that he was a fraud and she was the warrior. He needed to transfer the title. "You are the Unbroken. I am just the glass." His hand brushed against something that wasn't snow. Draven froze. He swept his numb fingers through the drift. He pulled out a piece of gray wool. It was her shawl, the coarse, heavy thing she wore to hide her thin arms. It was caught on a jagged thorn bush, ripped and fluttering in the gale. Draven pulled it free, clutching it to his chest. It was frozen stiff, coated in ice. He pressed his face into it. It smelled of her, faintly, fatting fast, but it also smelled of sickness. She had been here, recently. But the shawl was ripped, and near the base of the bush the snow was disturbed. There were tracks, not wolf tracks, not human tracks. Drag marks. Something had dragged her. Or she had collapsed and dragged herself. Draven stared at the marks leading deeper into the ravine, toward the jagged cliffs of the black ice ridge. That was rogue territory. That was where the exiles went to die, or where the scavengers waited for the weak to fall. A surge of adrenaline, dark and toxic, flooded his system. It wasn't the clean energy of the Alpha. It was the desperate, frantic energy of a man who has nothing left to lose. He forced his body to move. He didn't stand, he couldn't, but he scrambled on hands and knees, pushing through the drifts, ignoring the screaming of his joints. The pain was irrelevant now. The blood soaking his tunic was irrelevant. She was out there, she was hurt, she was alone, and for the first time in 10 years she didn't have the soul tether to save her. If she fell now, she fell alone. If she bled, it was her blood. "Hold on," he gasped, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. "I'm coming, I'm taking it back. I'll take it all back." He crawled into the teeth of the storm, a broken king hunting for the queen he had destroyed. Praying to a moon goddess, he no longer trusted that he wasn't too late to bleed for her. The trail ended in a hollow beneath the skeletal overhang of a dead pine, where the wind swirled in a tight, suffocating vortex. Draven didn't walk into the clearing. He dragged himself into it, his left leg useless, trailing behind him like a broken anchor. His vision was tunneling, the edges of his world blurring into gray static, but the center remained terrifiedly sharp. There, half buried in a drift that had already claimed her legs and waist, lay Alara. She was curled into a tight fetal ball, her knees pulled to her chest in a futile attempt to preserve warmth that had likely fled hours ago. The gray wool dress, the one he had mocked for being frumpy, for hiding the body of a Luna he wanted to show off, was shredded, snagged on the thorns of the thicket she had crawled through. Draven stopped. His heart, which had been hammering against his bruised ribs, skipped a beat, then another. The silence in the hollow was sudden and absolute. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Ilara. The name was a shard of glass in his throat. She didn't move. She didn't shiver. She lay with the stillness of stone, of things that were no longer part of the living world. Draven lunged forward, ignoring the scream of his own shattered knee. He scrambled over the snow and fell beside her, his hands trembling violently as he reached out. He was afraid to touch her. He was afraid that if he touched her, she would crumble into ash, finally consumed by the fire he had forced her to swallow for a decade. He grabbed her shoulder. It was hard and cold, like marble left out in the winter. He pulled her toward him, rolling her onto her side to see her face. Her skin was blue. Her lips were cracked and pale, parted slightly as if in mid-sentence. Her eyes were closed. Snow matted her lashes, freezing them against her cheeks. "No," Draven whispered, the word vibrating with a panic that eclipsed all physical pain. "No, no, no, you do not do this. You do not leave." He ripped the glove from his hand with his teeth and pressed his fingers to her neck, searching frantically for the rhythm of her life. His own pulse was thundering in his fingertips, making it impossible to tell. He pressed his ear to her chest, right over the heart she had touched before leaving him. He closed his eyes, straining against the howl of the wind. Silence. Then, a flutter. It was faint, erratic, weak as a dying moth trapped in a jar, but it was there. A beat. A pause. A beat. Her heart was stubborn. It was fighting, dragging itself through the sludge of hypothermia just as she had dragged herself through the snow. "You're alive." Draven sobbed, a sound that was half laugh, half retch. "You stupid, stubborn girl." He moved to gather her into his arms, to pull her against the furnace of his own feverish body, desperate to transfer heat. As he lifted her, her torn dress slipped from her shoulder, sliding down her back to reveal the skin beneath. Draven froze, his breath hitched in his throat, strangling him. He had expected her to be pale. He had expected her to be thin. He had not expected a map. The skin of her back, from her nape to the curve of her waist, was a tapestry of violence. It was a geography of ruin. There wasn't an inch of smooth flesh left. It was a kaleidoscope of silver, purple, and angry red scar tissue, layered over itself in a chaotic, brutal history. Draven stared, his eyes widening, his brain trying to reject what he was seeing. But the recognition was instantaneous. He knew these marks. He knew them because he had inflicted them. Just below her left shoulder blade, there were 4 jagged, parallel lines, thick ropes of raised keloid tissue that looked like they had been carved by a pitchfork. Draven's mind flashed back. 5 years ago, the skirmish with the northern bear shifters. A massive bear had swiped at him. Draven remembered the impact. He had staggered, but the claws hadn't pierced his armor. He had laughed, calling the bear weak. But here, on Alara's soft skin, the claws had dug deep. They had torn muscle and scraped bone. She had healed, but the scars remained, a permanent record of the blow he had ignored. He traced the lines with a shaking finger, horrified. His eyes moved lower. Across her mid-back, there was a patch of skin that looked melted, shiny and tight, puckered in a grotesque starburst pattern. The forest fire of Sector 7. He had run into a burning building to save a pup. A beam had fallen, showering him in sparks and embers. He had walked out with soot on his face, feeling heroic, untouched by the flames. Alara had burned. While he played the hero, her skin had been blistering, cooking under the heat he refused to feel. Draven retched, bile rising in his throat. He looked at the smaller marks, a circular indentation near her spine, the time he was shot with a bolt during a training accident, a jagged slash on her hip, the knife fight he won in 3 seconds. Every victory he had ever celebrated was written here. Every time the pack had cheered for the Unbroken, Alara had been in the shadows, being carved up by his glory. He wasn't a warrior. He was a painter, and she was the canvas, and his medium was pain. "I did this," he whispered, the realization crashing down on him with the weight of a mountain. "I did all of this." He looked at his own chest, wrapped in bandages, throbbing with the fresh wounds of the rogue. Those were nothing. They were child's play compared to the mutilation staring back at him. She hadn't just taken his pain, she had hoarded it. She had kept it inside her, layer upon layer, until she was more scar tissue than woman. And she had never said a word. She had let him call her weak while she carried the scars of 100 wars on her back. A sound began to build in Draven's chest. It started as a low rumble, a vibration of pure, distilled agony, and rose quickly, tearing through his throat. He threw his head back, his face turned toward the indifferent gray sky, and he howled. It was not the howl of an alpha. It wasn't a command, or a warning, or a signal. It was the sound of a soul breaking in half. It was a raw, discordant shriek of grief that echoed off the cliff faces, startling the crows from the trees. It was the sound of a man realizing that he was the villain of his own life story. He clutched her limp body to his chest, rocking back and forth in the snow, his tears falling hot onto her frozen skin. "Take it back," he screamed at the sky, his voice cracking. "Moon goddess, do you hear me? Take it back." He looked up, his eyes wild and bloodshot, searching the swirling clouds for a face, a sign, anything. "Give it to me," he begged. "Give me the scars, give me the burns, open my skin and heal hers. I am the one who earned them. I am the one who deserves them." He waited. He listened. He prayed with a ferocity he had never possessed in all his years of easy victories. He offered his strength, his title, his life. He begged for the magic to reverse, for the timeline to rewrite itself, for Alara to wake up smooth and whole while he disintegrated into the ruin he should have been. But the wind just whistled through the dead pine needles. The snow continued to fall, silent and cold, covering them both in white. There was no thunder. There was no divine voice. The moon goddess did not bargain with fools who realized the value of their treasure only after they had thrown it into the abyss. Draven looked down at Alara's still face. The silence was the answer. There was no magic fix. There was no undoing the damage. The scars on her back were real, and they were permanent, and they were his fault. He stopped screaming. The energy drained out of him, leaving him hollow. He wrapped his heavy fur cloak around her, covering the evidence of his sins, and pulled her tight against him. He couldn't heal her. He couldn't save her from what he had already done. "I got you," he whispered, his voice broken and small. "I'm here. I'm feeling it now, Alara. I promise. I'm feeling every bit of it." He buried his face in her neck, and for the first time in his life, Draven, the Unbroken, wept until he had no breath left to weep. The warmth that pulled Alara back from the gray edge of oblivion was not the gentle heat of a hearth fire, but a feverish, desperate burning. It pressed against her frozen skin, seeping into her marrow, demanding that she return to a world she had been entirely ready to leave. Her eyelashes, heavy with ice, fluttered against her cheeks. Opening her eyes felt like lifting heavy stones, but she forced them apart, the blurred white canopy of the storm slowly sharpening into a face she knew better than her own. Draven. He was hovering over her, shielding her from the wind with his own body. But this was not the Draven of the Great Hall, golden and untouchable. This man was a wreck. His face was gaunt, streaked with mud and tears. His eyes, usually terrifying in their intensity, were wide pools of panic. He was shivering violently, not from the cold, she realized with a jolt of dull surprise, but from pain. She could smell the blood on him, rich and coppery, mixing with the scent of pine. "Alara," his voice was a broken whisper, terrified that speaking too loud might shatter her. "Can you hear me? Please, just blink if you can hear me." Alara blinked. It was a small movement, but it made Draven exhale a sound that was half sob, half prayer. He pulled her tighter against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. His tears were hot against her freezing skin. "I found you," he choked out. "I found you, I'm sorry. Gods, Alara, I am so sorry." She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, stripped by the cold air. She managed only a rasping exhale. She looked up at him, confused by the agony etched into his features. Why was he crying? Why was the god of war on his knees in the snow, cradling the dying bird he had cast out? Then she saw his hand. He was gripping her arm, and his knuckles were split and bleeding. She shifted her gaze to his chest, where his tunic was torn, revealing bandages soaked in red. He was hurt. "You," she whispered, the word barely a breath. "You bleed." "Yes," Draven nodded frantically, shifting so she could see the misery in his eyes. "I bleed, I hurt, my knee is shattered. My ribs are grinding together. I can feel every single thing, Alara. The bond is gone, the shield is down." He looked down at her, his expression crumbling into absolute shame. "And I saw your back." Alara stiffened instinctively, trying to pull away, but she had no strength. She felt exposed, her secret shame laid bare under the gray sky. "Don't hide," Draven pleaded, his hand trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I saw the map, Alara. I saw the bare claws, the burns, the bolt wound. I saw 10 years of my own arrogance carved into your skin." He swallowed hard, his throat working against a lump of guilt that threatened to choke him. "I thought I was a god. I thought the moon goddess had blessed me. But she didn't bless me. She gave me you, and I used you as a meat shield." "It was my duty," Alara murmured, her eyes drifting shut as exhaustion tugged at her. "No," Draven's voice rose, desperate to keep her present. "It wasn't duty, it was torture. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me call you weak? Why did you let me mock you while you were bleeding for me?" Alara looked at him, her gaze clear and incredibly old. "Because you needed to be the Unbroken," she said softly. "The pack needs a symbol, Draven. They need to believe that their alpha is invincible. If they knew you were just a man, they would be afraid. And you loved the legend more than you loved the truth." Draven flinched as if she had struck him. "I don't care about the legend," he swore, his voice fierce. "I would burn the legend to ash right now if it meant taking one scar off your back. I reject it, Alara. I reject the title. I reject the glory. It's poison." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I will tell them. I will carry you back to the keep, and I will summon the entire pack, and I will show them my blood. I will tell them that I am a fraud and you are the warrior. I will spend the rest of my life on my knees if I have to. Just don't die. Please don't die." Alara offered him a sad, faint smile. "I didn't do it for your gratitude, Draven, and I didn't do it to be a warrior." She took a shallow, rattling breath. "I did it because a Sin-Eater doesn't choose their bond. The moon goddess chooses. She tied my life to yours. I chose to honor that tether, even when you wouldn't honor me." She coughed, a dry, hacking sound that racked her small frame with pain. "But the tether is gone now. You severed it." "I can fix it," Draven insisted, his hands hovering over her, wanting to heal her but knowing he was the cause of the disease. "We can make a new bond. I'll accept the pain. I'll take it all back." "It isn't that simple," Alara whispered. She looked at the sky where the snow was falling in relentless sheets. "The rejection, it didn't just return your mortality, Draven, it tore something out of me. A Sin-Eater cannot exist without a sin to eat. When you cut the bond, it was like opening an artery in my soul." She looked back at him, her eyes dimming. "I am hemorrhaging, Draven, not blood, spirit, the silence you gave me. It is killing me faster than the cold." Draven froze. The horror of her words settled into his bones. He had thought that by sending her away, he was saving her from his battles. Instead, he had unplugged her life support. She had been designed to carry his weight. Without it, she was unmoored, drifting into the void. "Then we rebond," Draven said, his voice shaking with a terrifying intensity. "Right now, here in the snow, we reforge the tether." "No," Alara said, closing her eyes again. "If we rebond just because you are afraid of pain or because you are guilty, the magic will reject it. It will poison us both." "Not guilt," Draven argued, grabbing her hand and pressing it against his chest, over the bandages, over the heart that was racing with fear. "Not guilt, Alara, look at me." She opened her eyes. She looked into the gold of his irises, searching for the arrogance she had known for a decade. She searched for the alpha who looked at her with contempt. She didn't find him. Instead, she found a man who was terrified, humbled, and completely stripped of his armor. She saw a man who was in agonizing pain and didn't care, because his only concern was the woman dying in his arms. "I don't want the bond because I need a shield," Draven vowed, his voice low and guttural. "I want the bond because I cannot breathe in a world where you aren't part of me. I don't want you to take my pain, Alara. I want to share yours. I want to carry you. I want to know when you hurt so I can stop the world to fix it." He squeezed her hand, his blood staining her pale fingers. "I am not asking for a Sin-Eater. I am asking for my mate. I am asking for Alara, not the useful version of you, just you. Broken, scarred, perfect you." Alara searched his face. She felt the truth of his words vibrating through the contact of their skin. For 10 years, she had been a utility to him, a tool he didn't know he was using. Now, finally, he was seeing her as a soul. But she was so tired. It would be so easy to just let go, to drift into the white snow and sleep forever, free of the burden of his life. "It will hurt," she whispered. "If we reconnect, the years of damage, the shock might kill us both." "Then we die together," Draven said without hesitation. "I would rather die holding you than live another day as the Unbroken." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The blizzard roared around them, a chaotic swirl of white, but in the small space between them, the air crackled with a sudden, latent energy. It was the ancient magic, the moon goddess watching, waiting to see if the choice was true. "Do you choose me?" Draven asked, his voice cracking. "Not the alpha, just the man who broke you. Do you choose to let me try to fix it?" Elara looked at the scars on his face, the worry lines, the dirt, the blood. She looked at the man who had hurt her more than any enemy, but who was now offering her his own life as penance. Forgiveness was not a feeling, it was a choice. It was the hardest choice in the world. Slowly, painfully, Elara lifted her hand from his chest and reached up to cup his cheek. Her thumb brushed away a tear that had frozen on his skin. "I choose you," she whispered. Draven closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a sob escaping his throat. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers, and opened his soul to the void he had created. "Then take me," he breathed. "Take me back." He kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a seal. It was a desperate, terrifying collision of two broken things trying to make a whole. And in the silence of the snow, something snapped. Not a bone, not a branch, but the air itself. A shockwave of invisible energy exploded outward from them, flattening the snow in a perfect circle. The tether slammed back into place, not gently, but with the violence of a thunderclap. Draven screamed. Elara gasped. The pain didn't vanish. It amplified. It became a shared, blinding white light that tore through them both, fusing their nerves, tangling their souls, and stitching the severed edges of their lives back together with a needle made of fire. They lay there in the snow, trembling, gasping, locked in a brutal embrace, uncertain if they were being healed or destroyed. The storm raged on, indifferent to their struggle, burying the past under fresh white, leaving only the question of whether they would survive the future they had just chosen. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under a shroud of blinding white. When the silhouette appeared at the edge of the tree line, the Obsidian Claw's pack fell silent. They had been waiting by the gates for hours, watching the forest with the collective anxiety of children waiting to see if their parents would return home. Viera stood at the front, her breath hitching in her throat as the figure slowly resolved into two. It wasn't the triumphant return of a god. It was the slow, agonizing march of mortals. Draven walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, his left leg dragging through the deep drifts. He was no longer the golden, upright statue of perfection they had worshipped. His posture was bent, his tunic was torn and bloodied, and his face was drawn with exhaustion. But he wasn't alone. His arm was wrapped tight around Elara's waist, taking the majority of her weight, while her arm was draped over his shoulders, her hand gripping his tunic for dear life. They moved as one terrifyingly fragile organism. Step, drag, pause, breathe. As they drew closer, the pack saw the truth written on their skin. The magic of the rebonding had not erased the past, it had distributed it. Elara's face was no longer pale with death, but flushed with the fever of healing. And Draven was changed. A fresh, jagged scar ran down his cheek, mirroring a wound Elara had once borne in secret. His hands were battered. The supernatural glow of invincibility was gone, replaced by the gritty, undeniable reality of survival. They reached the gates, and for a long moment no one spoke. There were no cheers of Unbroken. There was no chanting. The worship that had once fueled Draven's ego had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, reverent silence. The pack looked at their alpha, bleeding, limping, human, and then they looked at the woman he was holding up. They saw the way he looked at her, not with possession, but with a desperate, anchoring gratitude. They finally understood. The strength of the pack had never been one man's ability to avoid pain. It had been one woman's willingness to endure it. Vieira stepped forward, her eyes wet. She didn't bow. Instead, she simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect to Alara, the warrior she had been too blind to see. Draven didn't stop to address them. He didn't need to reclaim his title or spin a new legend. He simply tightened his grip on his mate, adjusting his stride to match her slow pace. He felt the ache in his knee with every step. He felt the burn in his chest where the rogue had struck him. He felt the ghost of every blow she had taken for 10 years, now humming in his own nerves. And he loved it. He loved the pain because it was real. He loved the scars because they were shared. "We are home," he whispered to her, his voice rough but steady. Alara looked up at him, her eyes tired but alive, shining with a quiet resilience that outshone any golden aura. "Yes," she breathed, leaning her head against his scarred shoulder. "We are." They walked past the silent crowd, leaving a trail of blood and broken snow behind them, two shattered halves that had finally, painfully, learned how to be whole. The god of war was dead, buried in the storm. In his place stood a husband who had learned that the only true invincibility is having a hand to hold when the world tries to break you. If Alara's sacrifice and Draven's redemption touched your heart, please don't leave this story in silence. Hit that subscribe button right now to join our pack. We tell the stories that others are afraid to whisper, tales of rejected mates, secret sacrifices, and love that fights back from the brink of death. Comment Unbroken below if you believe that true love isn't about being perfect, it's about healing together. Let us know, would you have forgiven him? Next video loading, the alpha who sold his memories to save his enemy. You won't believe the twist. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you in the next story.